Rivers on fire, not something you come across every day, but it's been happening since at least 1863, most recently in 2014. So join me as we cover these burning rivers. We'll look at the ones that have burned throughout history, some that have burned more than once, and even one that is burning right now. And then we'll dive deep into the Cuyahoga River, which caught fire so many times the government created the EPA to stop it from burning again. Our first river is the Volga. It's in Russia, obviously, and it first caught fire back in 1961. But this isn't your typical river fire. You see, it actually doesn't catch fire all that often. It's more of an oil field river. The Volgograd runs through the oil fields of Semetla. Back in 1961, there was a spill. Crude oil leaked from a pipeline, flowed into the river, and when it hit the air, ignited. Flames rose 100 feet in the air and burned for 5 days. Crews had to build earthen dams to separate the burning oil from the rest of the river. This time, they managed to contain it. But 3 years later, in 1964, another leak in the same pipeline resulted in a much worse fire. Once again, oil flowed into the river and ignited. This time the flames were 200 feet high and burned for almost 2 weeks. There was just no way to contain it. Finally, after the second week, the fire naturally extinguished itself. The water had run out. The oil had burned up completely. In total, the fires caused $7 million in damages. Today, there are still oil leaks in the Volga River. The pipeline is simply too old. They do their best to stop it from happening. But oil continues to seep into the Volga River, and whenever there's enough oil, it catches on fire. And sadly, it has in recent years. The most recent one happened in October of 2014. Again, oil seeped from the pipeline into the river, ignited by unknown sources. Flames were 100 feet high and took 11 days to put out. While we're on the subject of oil rivers, I should mention the River Thames. It caught fire back in 1889. London was covered in smoke. People couldn't see across the river. There was so much smoke. A common cause of river fires is industrial waste, things like oil and coal products. These rivers aren't catching fire because people are tossing burning logs into them. These are catching fire because of pollutants. That being said, there is one river that caught fire because someone threw a burning log in it. It's in Australia, and it's known as the Burning River because of this event. Before 1969, it was called the Canning Stockware River, but because of this incident, it earned a new name. It was May when Brian Elliott and his 2 sons were floating down the river. He threw a cigarette lighter into the river. It landed near some dried brush, and before he knew it, the whole river was on fire. The flames spread quickly and traveled 18 miles downstream. By the next day, firefighters had put the blaze under control, but it still smoldered beneath the surface. They couldn't get to it. It was too far downriver. They had to use helicopters to drop sand on the burning river. Eventually, the river went out on its own, but only after charring both sides of the river back. The Seine River is located in France, and it caught fire twice, once in 1909 and again in 1916. At the time, there were around 140 barges docked along the river, and they were filled with various materials, including hay, zinc and chemicals. One of the barges sprung a leak. The contents spilled into the river and then caught fire. The next one wasn't nearly as bad. A simple discarded matchstick was enough to ignite a pile of oily rags in the river. When we think of rivers on fire, we tend to imagine raging flames and boiling water. But sometimes the water isn't boiling. Sometimes the river just sort of smokes. A good example is the Tisza. It flows through Hungary, and back in 2000, the river started smoking. The locals noticed a strange black substance covering the water, and at first they thought it was oil. They called the fire department, but once firefighters got to the river, they realized it was a chemical spill. Factories in the area were dumping cyanide and other chemicals into the river. The water wasn't boiling, but it wasn't safe either. The fish had died, but the water was still flowing. What's worse, the water made its way into Lake Balaton, one of Europe's largest lakes. In total, 160,000 gallons of chemicals had spilled into the river. I mentioned earlier that the River Thames had caught fire. Well, it did it again. This time it was during World War II, specifically on May 1941. Bombs had fallen on the docks along the river and ignited the oil there. As the war went on, the Thames would catch fire several more times, but this one was particularly memorable. You can watch the flames rise from the London Bridge. In the United States, we have the Great Miami River. It starts in Ohio and makes its way down south. In 1925, it caught fire in Hamilton, Ohio. Oil had been dumped into the river, and somehow it managed to burn without the water boiling. Thankfully, the fire department showed up in time and used their boats to douse the flames. One river that caught fire more than once is the Capilla. It's located in British Columbia, Canada. The first time it caught fire was in 1916. Logging debris was floating down the river and somehow ignited. The second time it caught fire was 1958. Flames burned from one end of town to the other. Homes had to be evacuated. Thankfully, rain came and extinguished the fire. And the third time was 1978. Firefighters spent 2 days putting out small flames, but nothing compares to what happened in Cleveland. This is the Cuyahoga River. This river ran straight through Cleveland. It was super polluted. Factories, mills, and other businesses dumped their wastes into the chemicals, plastics, metals, all of it went into the river, but the river caught fire over and over and over. In fact, it caught fire 13 times between 1920 and 1969. The worst one was in 1952. Hundreds of workers watched as the river burst into flames. There was so much pollution in the water that it burned for 5 days straight. Then in 1964, it caught fire again. The chief of the Cleveland Fire Department refused to send his men to fight it. He said it was a useless mission. The water was so polluted, it didn't matter if they doused the flames. It would just burn right back up. Now, why was this river burning so much? Well, because of all those factories, mills and businesses along the banks. There was a lot of debris floating in the river. Oil, chemicals and metals were making their way downstream. Eventually, the stuff would build up along the riverbanks. Then one little spark was all it took. This old metal bridge here is a good example. The pollution built up underneath it, and then when a passing train ignited the fumes, the whole thing would burn. In 1968, President Johnson declared the Cuyahoga a navigable waterway. It was so polluted, you couldn't navigate it. In 1969, it caught fire again, and this time the US government stepped in. They sent in the Coast Guard. They arrested 9 people for dumping their waste into the river. They tried to clean up the mess, but it was a long process. All that pollution had taken years to accumulate. And then in 1970, Congress passed the Clean Water Act. It wasn't just for the Cuyahoga River, it was for all the rivers and lakes and streams in America. The Cuyahoga River did finally clean up. These days, you can kayak down the river, but if we hadn't stepped in, who knows what would have happened. Maybe it would still be burning today. And speaking of cleaning up rivers, if you want to help clean up the environment, then I have the perfect product for you. Thanks for watching.